Sometimes the prayers we answer belong to strangers, and sometimes those strangers quietly change our lives forever. Snow drifted sideways across the lonely Wyoming highway like the sky had forgotten how to stop falling. The kind of winter storm that made most people drive slower, pray harder, or stay home entirely. Caleb Walker had done all three before in different seasons of life. Tonight, though, he kept driving. The heater in his old black pickup barely worked, coughing warm air only when it felt generous, and the windshield wipers moved with the slow, stubborn rhythm of something too tired to quit. Beside him sat Shadow, a black and tan German shepherd with tired amber eyes and a habit of watching the road like he understood danger before it arrived. Caleb glanced briefly toward the dog and shook his head. "You know," he muttered quietly, voice rough from years in cold weather, "we probably should have stopped back in Casper." Shadow barely reacted, just kept staring ahead through the windshield as snow swallowed most of the world outside. Caleb understood the feeling. At 48 years old, retired from the Navy SEAL teams, and carrying more memories than plans, life had become something simpler now. Temporary jobs, cheap motels when money allowed, truck stops when it did not, quiet places where nobody asked too many questions. He liked it that way most days. Solitude felt easier than explaining things people could never really understand. The storm worsened as midnight crept closer. Somewhere outside Sheridan, Caleb noticed the glowing lights of an old gas station near the highway exit. Half the sign flickered. The parking lot looked nearly empty except for a snow-covered sedan and a broken vending machine leaning sideways near the entrance. Closed. Probably hours ago. Caleb considered driving past, but the gas gauge sat too low for confidence, and coffee sounded better than another hour of silence. He turned into the lot slowly, tires crunching across fresh snow. Shadow lifted his head immediately. Alert now. Not nervous. Focused. Caleb noticed the shift instantly. Years of trusting instincts made him pay attention when the dog acted differently. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Shadow stood halfway on the seat, ears raised toward the front of the building. Caleb followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing except darkness and blowing snow beneath weak parking lot lights. Then movement. Small, barely noticeable, near the side wall of the station beneath a rusted awning. Caleb frowned. Someone sitting there. Too small to be an adult. "No," he muttered softly under his breath. "Could not be. Not in weather like this." He shut off the truck and stepped into freezing wind, immediately regretting the decision. Cold wrapped around him fast, sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Shadow jumped down beside him without hesitation. Together they crossed the parking lot through snow that reached nearly halfway up Caleb's boots. The closer he got, the clearer the shape became. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Thin winter coat, far too light for weather like this. Gloves missing, knees tucked close to her chest as she sat trembling against the wall. Curled beside her was a tiny puppy wrapped poorly inside an old blanket, shaking hard enough Caleb could see it even through falling snow. The girl looked up slowly as footsteps approached. Pale cheeks, red nose, eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion children should never wear. But what hit Caleb hardest was not fear in her expression. It was how unsurprised she looked to still be there alone. Shadow moved closer first. Slowly, carefully. The German shepherd lowered himself near the puppy without barking, body close enough to block cold wind. The tiny dog shifted weakly against his fur almost immediately. Caleb crouched down, knees protesting quietly against frozen pavement. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice calm. "What are you doing out here?" The girl hesitated before answering. "Waiting." Her voice sounded thin, fragile. Caleb glanced around instinctively. Empty parking lot. No moving cars. No lights except the station sign buzzing overhead. "Waiting for who?" he asked gently. The girl looked down at the puppy before pulling the blanket tighter. "Mom," she whispered. Something about the answer settled wrong immediately. Caleb studied her closer. Clothes too thin. Shoes soaked from snow. Fingers red from cold. Nobody leaves a little kid outside this long in weather like this unless something has gone terribly wrong. Caleb quietly removed his gloves and rubbed warmth back into his hands. Then, without thinking too hard about it, he unzipped the heavy military winter coat he still wore every cold season. The only truly warm thing he owned anymore. "Here," he said softly, wrapping it gently around her shoulders before she could refuse. "You need this more than me." The girl looked startled, like kindness had interrupted something painful she expected to last forever. But you will be cold, she said quietly. Caleb gave the smallest shrug. I have been cold before. Shadow shifted closer beside the puppy, laying fully against it now while snow continued drifting sideways through the parking lot. The little dog stopped shaking almost immediately. Caleb looked toward the road again. Empty. No headlights. No movement. Something tightened quietly in his chest. Then the girl said something so softly he almost missed it. Mom says God forgot us. Snow moved gently across the empty parking lot, while Caleb stared at the dark highway and realized something that made his stomach sink. Nobody was coming. Caleb stood still for several seconds while snow drifted around them in slow, restless waves, the kind of cold that slipped through boots and settled deep into old bones. He looked again toward the empty highway, hoping headlights might suddenly appear and make sense of everything. Nothing. Just darkness and wind. Beside the little puppy, Shadow remained perfectly calm, stretched carefully against the shaking animal as if he already understood what needed to happen. The little dog had stopped trembling quite so hard now, pressing weakly into the warmth of the German Shepherd's thick coat. Caleb exhaled slowly and rubbed one hand over the back of his neck. All right, he said quietly, voice softer than usual. You hungry? The girl hesitated before nodding once. Small. Careful. Like even answering yes might cost something. Caleb glanced toward the station door, even though he already knew it was locked. Closed for hours. But a vending machine still hummed weakly near the entrance, tilted slightly beneath frost. He reached into his pocket and counted what little cash remained. Not much. Enough for gas if he stretched things carefully. Maybe breakfast tomorrow if luck decided to show up for once. He stared at the wrinkled bills for half a second before walking toward the machine anyway. Some choices stopped feeling like choices after enough years. A few minutes later, Caleb returned carrying crackers, bottled water, peanut butter snacks, and the only thing remotely warm he could manage from an old coffee dispenser inside the gas station entry area that somehow still worked. Hot chocolate. Barely warm, but warm enough. He crouched carefully beside the girl again and held out the cup. Slow sips, he said. Do not burn yourself. The girl wrapped both freezing hands around the paper cup, eyes widening slightly as warmth touched her skin. For the first time since Caleb had arrived, she looked less scared and more surprised, like she had forgotten warmth could exist at all. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice cracked from cold. Caleb opened the crackers and placed them gently near her while watching Shadow glance back toward him briefly before lowering his head beside the puppy again. Always watching. Always reading the room better than most people. What is your name? Caleb finally asked. The girl looked down at the puppy first, gently adjusting the blanket around it before answering. Mia. Caleb nodded once. I am Caleb. Then he motioned toward the German Shepherd. And this overgrown babysitter is Shadow. For the first time, the smallest smile touched Mia's face. Tiny. Quick. Gone almost immediately. But real. He looks brave, she said quietly. Caleb glanced toward Shadow. He thinks he runs the world. Shadow flicked one ear without moving. Mia carefully held out trembling fingers toward the German Shepherd. Shadow lowered his head slowly, calm and patient, allowing her to pet him without hesitation. Something softened in Caleb's chest watching it happen. Animals knew things people forgot. Fear, loneliness, sadness. Somehow they always seemed to understand without needing explanations. After a few moments, Caleb looked toward the highway again. How long have you been waiting out here? Mia stared at the snow. Since dark. Caleb frowned harder. That could mean hours. Your mom told you to stay here? Mia hesitated, then shook her head slowly. She went to ask someone for help. Something about the sentence settled heavily in the cold air between them. Caleb knew desperation when he heard it. Knew the sound of somebody hanging on to pride with shaking hands because there was nothing else left. He had worn that same look himself before. Too many times. Where are you staying? He asked carefully. Mia pointed weakly across the highway toward a row of flickering motel lights in the distance. Cheap roadside place. Half-broken sign. Probably the kind rented by the week because nobody could afford better. Caleb stood slowly and looked toward it, jaw tightening. Snow had started falling harder now. Wind stronger too. This weather could turn dangerous quickly. He looked back at Mia's soaked shoes, red hands, exhausted face, and the puppy still tucked beside Shadow. Then he looked toward his truck. Small cab, old heater, limited gas, but warmer than this. Much warmer. Caleb crouched again. Tell you what, he said gently. How about we warm up in the truck while we wait for your mom? Mia hesitated. Understandable. Stranger danger lived in the world for good reason. Caleb did not rush her. Instead, he quietly sat down against the wall beside them, snow collecting across his shoulders now that his coat belonged to somebody else. No pressure, he said softly. But freezing is a terrible hobby. To his surprise, Mia giggled quietly. Small sound. Fragile, but alive. Somewhere above them, wind rattled the old gas station sign, while Shadow carefully shifted closer around the puppy again. Caleb glanced briefly toward the dark sky. Funny how life worked sometimes. One minute you were trying to survive your own problems. The next, somebody colder than you needed what little warmth you still had left. And maybe, just maybe, kindness mattered more when it cost something. If stories like this touch your heart, please remember to like and subscribe so you do not miss more meaningful journeys ahead. Then Mia looked toward the dark motel lights across the road and whispered something that made Caleb's stomach sink all over again. Mom said if she did not come back soon, I should pray. The wind pushed harder against the old gas station awning while Caleb stood silently for a moment, letting Mia's words settle somewhere deep where old memories still lived. Pray. Funny thing about prayer. Most people turn toward it when everything else stopped working. Caleb used to believe in certainty, in plans, in training, in things you could hold with your hands and control with enough preparation. But life had a way of humbling people, especially soldiers who learned too late that not every battle listened to strength. Snow continued gathering across the empty parking lot, while Shadow finally stood, gently nudging the tiny puppy with his nose before looking directly at Caleb. That look again. Calm. Certain. Like the German shepherd had already made the decision for both of them. Caleb sighed quietly through the cold. All right, he muttered. Guess we are not leaving yet. He turned toward Mia and offered a careful smile. Come on. Let us get you warm. This time she hesitated only a little before standing. The military coat nearly swallowed her smaller frame, sleeves hanging past her hands. Caleb picked up the puppy carefully inside its thin blanket, while Shadow stayed close beside Mia, walking slowly through the snow toward the truck like some oversized bodyguard. The warmth inside the pickup was far from impressive, but compared to the freezing parking lot it felt almost luxurious. Caleb turned the heater all the way up and handed Mia another snack packet from the dashboard. Shadow climbed into the back seat, though not before checking the puppy again like he had somehow appointed himself caretaker for the evening. Mia sat quietly for several minutes, warming her fingers against the vents while snow tapped softly against the windows. Caleb waited before asking more questions. No pressure, no interrogation. Kids trusted silence more than adults usually remembered. Finally, Mia looked toward the motel lights across the road. Mom should have come back already, she whispered. Caleb followed her gaze. Half the motel sign flickered weakly in red neon. Vacancy. Missing letters. The kind of roadside place people ended up at when life stopped offering good options. What room? He asked gently. 7, Mia answered softly. Caleb nodded once. You and your mom staying there long? Mia shrugged. A few weeks. Then quieter. After the apartment. Caleb did not ask what happened to the apartment. He already knew enough versions of that story. Bills. Illness. Job loss. Bad luck stacking faster than hope could keep up. He had seen life corner good people before. Sometimes all at once. Shadow suddenly lifted his head from the back seat. Alert again. Watching the motel. Caleb noticed immediately. The German shepherd rarely reacted without reason. What is it? He asked softly. Shadow let out the faintest sound in his throat before resting one paw gently against the seat, eyes fixed forward. Caleb looked back toward room 7. One dim yellow light still glowed behind thin curtains. Strange. If Mia had been waiting this whole time, somebody should have checked on her by now. Unless something else was wrong. Caleb rubbed one hand slowly against the steering wheel. Part of him wanted to stay out of it. He had learned years ago that people carried problems bigger than strangers understood. But another part of him remembered seeing frozen fingers wrapped around a paper cup and hearing a child quietly say God forgot them. That part was harder to ignore. Tell you what, Caleb said gently after a moment. How about we go check on your mom together? Mia looked nervous immediately. What if she is upset? Caleb offered a small tired smile. Parents usually get upset because they care. Mia thought about that quietly before nodding. Outside, snow had started falling heavier again. Caleb wrapped the puppy inside an old wool blanket from behind the seat, while Mia climbed carefully from the truck. Shadow stepped beside her instantly, close enough that his shoulder brushed her leg as they crossed the parking lot and approached the motel. Room 7 sat near the far end beneath a flickering light bulb buzzing softly against the storm. Caleb knocked once. No answer. He waited. Knocked again. Still nothing. Mia looked down suddenly. Worried now. Mom? She called softly through the door. Silence. Caleb tried the handle gently. Unlocked. Something about that unsettled him. Slowly, carefully, he opened the door. Warm air barely touched them. More like stale cold pretending to be heat. The motel room looked worn thin by too many hard stories. Peeling wallpaper. Small table stacked with medicine bottles. Half-eaten crackers near the sink. A heater rattling weakly in the corner like it might stop any second. And there, curled beneath a thin blanket on the bed, lay a woman no older than her early 30s. Pale. Exhausted. Eyes half open like staying awake had become too expensive. She looked toward the doorway slowly, confused at first, then suddenly terrified seeing strangers beside her daughter. Mia ran forward immediately. Mom. The woman tried to sit up too fast and coughed weakly instead. Caleb stepped back instinctively, hands raised slightly. Calm. Non-threatening. Easy, he said quietly. She was outside near the gas station. Cold. We just wanted to make sure you were all right. The woman stared at him for several long seconds, breathing unevenly before finally whispering something so quiet Caleb almost missed it. I only left for 20 minutes. But even as she said it, both of them knew 20 minutes had turned into something much longer. For a few quiet seconds, nobody moved. Snow tapped softly against the motel window, while the weak heater rattled like it had already given up trying. Caleb stood near the doorway, cold still clinging to his shoulders now that his coat belonged to somebody else. Shadow stayed close beside Mia, calm but watchful, his large frame somehow making the worn motel room feel safer without trying. The puppy rested curled against the German shepherd's front paws, finally warm enough to sleep. Mia climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed beside her mother and reached for her hand. Mom, are you okay? She whispered. The woman forced the smallest smile, though exhaustion sat heavily across her face. I am okay, sweetheart, she said softly, voice thin and strained. Then her eyes moved back toward Caleb. Wary at first, embarrassed second, grateful somewhere underneath both. I am sorry, she said quietly. I did not mean for her to stay outside that long. Caleb shook his head once. No apology needed. He glanced briefly toward the medicine bottles scattered near the sink. Cheap over-the-counter cold medication. Prescription labels half peeled away. A thermometer. Half-finished soup cup gone cold. Little things people left around when life stopped leaving room for pride. You got sick? He asked carefully. The woman hesitated before nodding. Flu turned into something worse, she admitted quietly. I went looking for help when the motel office closed early. She looked down for a moment like the truth tasted bitter. Car would not start. Phone died. I figured 20 minutes. Caleb understood that kind of math. The desperate kind. The kind people made when there were no good choices left. What is your name? He asked. Rachel, she answered softly. Rachel Harper. Caleb gave a small nod. Caleb Walker. Then motioned toward the dog. Shadow. Mia finally looked up again, holding the puppy close now beneath Caleb's oversized coat. His name is Lucky, she said quietly. Caleb almost smiled at that. Funny name for a puppy sitting half-frozen outside a gas station. But maybe surviving counted as luck too. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, coughing lightly before pulling the blanket closer around herself. You do not have to stay, she said softly, though her tired expression suggested she hoped he ignored the sentence. Caleb looked around the room again. The heater clicked weakly before coughing out barely warm air. Half working at best. Probably one cold hour away from quitting entirely. The tiny refrigerator hummed louder than the heater itself. Grocery bag near the trash, almost empty. Not enough food. Not enough warmth. Not enough anything. He had seen places like this before. Usually from the outside. Sometimes from inside. How long have you been here? Caleb asked quietly. Rachel hesitated. Almost 3 weeks. Her voice lowered. After the apartment. There it was again. Life happening too fast for people to stop it. Caleb did not ask for details. Job loss, medical bills, rent increase, bad timing, grief. America had 100 ways of making decent people feel invisible. Instead, he glanced toward the struggling heater again. Mind if I take a look at that thing? Rachel looked confused for a second. You fix heaters? Caleb shrugged lightly. I fix whatever quits before I do. That earned the faintest laugh Mia had managed all night. Small, but enough to shift something inside the room. Caleb knelt beside the rattling heater while Shadow quietly rested near the bed, watching everyone with steady, patient eyes. Lucky slept curled into the German Shepherd's side like he had already decided safety lived there now. The heater panel barely held together, screws loose and dust thick inside. Caleb frowned. Old unit. Neglected, but fixable. After several quiet minutes adjusting vents, tightening connections, and clearing buildup with an old pocket tool, the machine coughed harder before finally pushing warmer air into the room. Not perfect. Better. Much better. Mia's eyes widened instantly. It is warmer, she whispered. Caleb stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands. Should hold for now. Rachel looked like she wanted to argue, apologize, and cry all at once. Instead, she simply whispered, "Thank you." Caleb looked away slightly. Gratitude always sat awkwardly with him. Somewhere along the years, he stopped expecting thanks for things people should do anyway. He stepped toward the door. I will grab a few things, he said casually. Back in a bit. Rachel blinked. You do not have to, I know. He said it gently. Outside, the storm had softened slightly, though cold still bit hard enough to sting. Caleb walked back toward his pickup while snow crunched beneath worn boots. He checked what little cash remained in his wallet. Not much. Less than comfortable. Maybe not enough for himself another day or two. He stared at the bills for a second before folding them shut again. Funny thing about kindness. Sometimes it cost exactly what you could not spare. An hour later, Caleb returned carrying groceries, canned soup, cold medicine, bread, dog food, bottled water, and an old spare blanket from the truck bed. Rachel looked speechless. Mia nearly burst into tears. Caleb pretended not to notice either one. Just temporary stuff, he muttered, setting bags on the counter. Nobody thinks clearly hungry. Shadow suddenly stood and walked toward the small table near the motel window. He stopped there, staring strangely at an unopened envelope tucked beneath a Bible, then looked back toward Caleb. Calm. Still. Certain. Something about the way Shadow watched it made Caleb pause. Dogs notice things people missed. And for reasons he could not explain yet, that envelope suddenly felt important. Caleb stood quietly near the motel window while snow drifted softly beneath flickering parking lot lights. The room had grown warmer now, though warmth alone never fixed everything. Rachel sat against the headboard looking exhausted in the kind of way sleep no longer solved. Mia had fallen asleep curled beside Lucky beneath Caleb's old military coat, one small hand resting protectively over the puppy, as if she had learned too young how quickly comfort disappeared. Shadow still stood near the small table, watching the envelope, waiting. Caleb had learned a long time ago not to ignore instincts, especially when they belonged to a dog who somehow always noticed things before anyone else. He keeps looking at that, Caleb said quietly, motioning toward the table. Rachel glanced over, expression shifting almost immediately. Not fear exactly, more like sadness wrapped inside embarrassment. It is nothing, she said softly. Caleb nodded once, though something about the pause before her answer told a different story. He did not push. Some wounds opened slowly. Outside, wind rattled weak motel windows while the heater hummed louder now, fighting hard against winter. Rachel stared quietly toward Mia sleeping beside the puppy before finally speaking again. I applied for emergency housing, she admitted softly. That envelope came yesterday. She hesitated. I have not opened it yet. Caleb looked toward the table again. Why not? Rachel let out a tired breath that sounded older than her years. Because if they said no, she stopped there. Some sentences finished themselves. Caleb understood. Hope became dangerous when people ran out of backup plans. He walked over slowly and picked up the envelope, careful not to intrude too much. Government stamp. County Assistant's Office. Still sealed. Shadow sat quietly beside him now, calm but attentive. Mind if I ask something? Caleb said gently. Rachel nodded. What happens if it is bad news? Her eyes dropped toward the floor. I guess we keep surviving. Caleb hated that answer because he recognized it. Survival without hope. Just getting through the next hour. Then the next day, hoping something changed before everything broke completely. He carefully placed the envelope back on the table. Maybe open it tomorrow, he said quietly. Tonight feels heavy enough already. Rachel almost smiled at that. Small, tired, but real. A few minutes later, Caleb quietly gathered his things. He never stayed where he was not needed. Old habit. Temporary people learn not to unpack too deeply. Before leaving, he folded 2 extra $20 bills beneath a grocery receipt near the counter. Quiet help counted best when pride stayed intact. Rachel noticed anyway. You do not have to do this, she whispered. Caleb shrugged lightly. I know. Then he glanced toward sleeping Mia. Kids should not have to worry this much. Rachel looked down, blinking quickly before emotion could fully arrive. She thinks I can fix everything, she said softly. Caleb stared toward the motel window for a moment. Most kids do. Outside, snow had finally slowed by the time Caleb stepped back into the cold. Shadow followed beside him while the parking lot settled into deep midnight silence. The pickup started harder than usual, engine coughing twice before finally turning over. Caleb sat behind the wheel for several quiet moments without driving. Funny thing about helping people. Sometimes it left your own problems waiting patiently when you got back. By sunrise, reality returned fast. Caleb drove 30 miles to the ranch outside Sheridan, where he had been doing temporary repair work the past week. Honest work. Long hours. Enough to barely stay ahead. The ranch owner met him near the barn with hands buried inside his coat pockets and the uncomfortable look people wore when bad news arrived early. Caleb recognized it instantly. I hate this, the man said quietly, snow crunching beneath his boots. But my brother showed up from Colorado. Family situation. Caleb already understood before the sentence finished. You do not need me anymore. The ranch owner nodded apologetically. Wish timing was different. He handed Caleb a final envelope with cash. Smaller than expected. Much smaller. I am sorry. Caleb thanked him anyway. No anger. Just exhaustion. Life rarely asked permission before changing direction. By afternoon, another problem arrived. Halfway down Interstate 90, the pickup shuddered hard before losing power near an empty stretch of road outside a tiny Wyoming town nobody remembered unless they broke down there. Caleb managed to coast toward an abandoned gas station lot before the engine died completely. Wind pushed across frozen asphalt while dark clouds gathered again overhead. He checked the engine twice. Same result both times. Transmission trouble. Expensive trouble. The kind temporary jobs did not cover. He climbed back inside the cab and counted money slowly. Rent for a motel? No. Repair shop? Definitely no. Enough gas left for maybe another day if the truck still moved. Which it did not. Shadow climbed into the passenger seat quietly, resting his head near Caleb's arm without making a sound. Outside, daylight faded fast. Snow threatened again. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly through cold wind. Caleb barely noticed at first, but Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears alert, then stood immediately. Focused now. Certain. Before Caleb could react, the German shepherd nudged his arm once, then moved toward the truck door like he already knew exactly where they needed to go. Caleb looked toward the darkening road, and then back at Shadow standing beside the truck door with unusual determination. The church bells rang again somewhere through the cold Wyoming air, soft and distant at first, almost swallowed by the wind. Most people probably would have ignored them. Most people would have stayed in the truck, cursed their luck, and waited for morning. But Caleb had learned long ago that when Shadow acted certain about something, it usually mattered. You hear something I do not? Caleb asked quietly. Shadow glanced back once, then nudged the door harder with his nose. Persistent now. Caleb sighed softly and pulled his jacket tighter against the cold. All right, he muttered. Lead the way. Snow crunched beneath worn boots as they followed the sound of church bells through quiet streets lined with dark storefronts and sleeping pickup trucks dusted in snow. The town looked forgotten in the way many small Wyoming places eventually did. One diner closed early. One gas station still glowing weakly. A few tired Christmas lights left hanging too long after winter holidays. The cold settled deeper now, sharp enough to sting the inside of Caleb's lungs every time he breathed. Still, Shadow kept moving with confidence, tail steady, posture calm, occasionally glancing back only to make sure Caleb followed. After nearly 15 minutes, they reached the edge of town, where warm yellow light spilled softly from the windows of a small white church tucked behind tall pine trees. Simple place. Wooden sign out front reading Grace Community Chapel. Snow covered most of the steps leading to the entrance, but someone had shoveled a narrow path recently. The church bell finally stopped ringing just as Shadow climbed the steps without hesitation. Caleb stood there for a moment, hands deep in coat pockets, uncertain why this suddenly felt harder than it should. Maybe because churches had always complicated things for him. Faith came easier before funerals, before losses, before years taught him some prayers got answered while others disappeared into silence. Shadow nudged the front door gently. Warm light spilled out immediately. Standing inside was an older man wearing jeans, boots, and a thick wool sweater beneath a worn jacket. Late 60s maybe. Kind eyes. The kind people trusted without knowing why. He looked surprised for half a second before smiling softly. "Well?" the man said warmly, glancing at Shadow first. "Looks like somebody brought company." Caleb hesitated. "Sorry to bother you," he said quietly. "Truck broke down outside town." The older man nodded immediately like explanations were unnecessary. "Then you came to the right place." He stepped aside without hesitation. "Come inside before winter decides to finish the job." Warmth hit Caleb almost painfully the moment he entered. Coffee, old wood, soup simmering somewhere nearby. The kind of warmth that felt earned. Shadow walked calmly inside as though he had been there before. The older man laughed softly at that. "Your dog acts like he already knows the place." "He usually acts like he owns places," Caleb muttered. That earned the first real smile he had felt in days. "I am Pastor Michael," the man said, extending a hand. Caleb shook it briefly. "Caleb Walker." Something shifted immediately in the pastor's expression. Subtle, quick, familiarity maybe. "Walker," he repeated thoughtfully. "You military?" Caleb nodded once. "Retired Navy SEAL." Pastor Michael blinked slowly, then glanced down briefly like memory had just walked unexpectedly into the room. "That is something," he said quietly. "Strange timing sometimes." Caleb frowned slightly, but said nothing. Shadow had already settled near a fireplace in the corner, lying down with complete peace, as if the decision to come here had finally been completed. Pastor Michael motioned toward a chair near the fire. "Sit," he said kindly. "Nobody thinks clearly hungry or cold." A few minutes later, Caleb found himself holding hot coffee while a bowl of chicken soup rested in front of him. Simple meal, but somehow better than anything expensive. Hunger always reminded people how little comfort actually cost. Silence settled gently between them for a while, broken only by the crackle of firewood and distant wind outside. Then Pastor Michael looked carefully at Caleb again. "You said your last name is Walker?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah." The pastor leaned back slightly, thoughtful now. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "A few nights ago, a young woman staying near Sheridan asked me to pray for somebody named Caleb." Caleb looked up immediately. Something tightened unexpectedly in his chest. "What young woman?" Pastor Michael stood slowly and walked toward a nearby shelf filled with donated blankets and community paperwork. After a moment, he pulled out a folded paper. Child drawing. Crayons. Crooked lines. A little girl holding hands with a man beside a very large dog. Caleb froze. He recognized it instantly. Mia's drawing. Pastor Michael looked genuinely confused now. "You know this family?" Caleb stared quietly at the picture. Snow drifted softly beyond church windows while warmth from the fireplace suddenly felt heavier somehow. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think I do." Pastor Michael hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Then maybe you should know something." He paused briefly. "That family has been praying for a miracle." The fire crackled softly inside Grace Community Chapel while Caleb sat unmoving, Mia's crayon drawing resting carefully between his hands. Outside, snow drifted gently across the church windows, soft and quiet now, like winter itself had grown tired. Shadow slept peacefully near the fireplace, though every so often one ear lifted toward Caleb as if making sure nothing important was missed. Pastor Michael poured fresh coffee into an old ceramic mug before sitting across from him. "You helped them, did not you?" the pastor asked gently. Caleb looked down at the drawing again. A crooked little sketch. Mia standing beside Lucky. Shadow somehow drawn larger than life. And beside them, a man wearing a coat she had colored dark green. even though Caleb knew the coat was now hanging somewhere around Mia's shoulders instead of his own. Just try to help, Caleb said quietly. Pastor Michael nodded slowly like he understood something bigger sat inside those words. Rachel talks about somebody who stopped for her daughter, he said softly. Said God finally sent kindness wearing work boots. Caleb shifted slightly in his chair, uncomfortable already. Praise always landed wrong with him. She gives God too much credit, he muttered. The pastor smiled gently. Funny thing about faith, he said. Sometimes God works through tired people who think they are only passing through. Silence settled for a while after that. Caleb stared into the coffee, letting warmth reach hands that still felt cold from too many winters. Then Pastor Michael stood slowly and walked toward a filing cabinet near the church office. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn folder. There is something strange you should probably know, he said quietly. Caleb looked up. The pastor hesitated before opening the file carefully. Inside rested old paperwork, faded photographs, and a newspaper clipping folded neatly with age. Rachel's father attended this church years ago, Pastor Michael explained. Good man. Veteran too. Caleb listened quietly. Before he passed away, he told me something I never forgot. The pastor paused briefly. He said somebody in uniform once saved his life without ever learning his name. Caleb frowned slightly. What does that have to do with me? Pastor Michael slid the newspaper clipping gently across the table. Caleb unfolded it carefully. Old article. Military evacuation overseas after severe flooding nearly 15 years earlier. Volunteers. Service members. Emergency rescue operations. Caleb's eyes stopped suddenly. Familiar place. Familiar year. Familiar mission. That cannot be right, he said quietly. Pastor Michael nodded slowly. Rachel's father was trapped there during a medical outreach trip. Said one Navy SEAL carried him to safety after floodwaters destroyed the road. Caleb stared at the faded photograph longer now. He barely remembered that deployment. Long days. Exhaustion. Faces blurred together after enough rescues. You stopped counting names eventually because carrying too many stories home hurt worse. I do not remember him, Caleb admitted softly. You probably were not supposed to, Pastor Michael replied kindly. But he remembered you. Caleb looked toward the fireplace where Shadow finally opened one eye before settling again. Strange thing about life. Sometimes moments you forgot entirely stayed alive inside somebody else forever. Pastor Michael leaned forward slightly. Rachel's father used to say one thing over and over before he died. He smiled faintly. He said if he ever had the chance, he wanted to repay the kindness of the soldier who saved him. Caleb looked away toward snow gathering outside. Life does not usually work like that. Maybe not, Pastor Michael said quietly. But faith sometimes does. Before Caleb could answer, the front church door opened suddenly, letting cold wind rush inside. Shadow stood immediately, alert but calm. Caleb turned instinctively. Standing near the entrance beneath falling snow was Rachel. Pale still, tired, but stronger than before. Mia stood beside her wrapped tightly inside Caleb's oversized coat, while Lucky rested in her arms. For a second nobody said anything. Mia smiled first. Small but bright. I knew you would be here, she said quietly. Caleb looked genuinely confused. How? Mia pointed immediately toward Shadow. He looks like he knows things. That earned the smallest laugh Caleb had managed in weeks. Rachel stepped closer slowly, hands nervous around the strap of her bag. Pastor Michael called, she explained softly. Then she looked down for a moment before meeting Caleb's eyes again. I opened the envelope. Something shifted in her voice. Not sadness this time. Shock maybe. Relief too. Caleb leaned back slightly. Good news. Rachel swallowed hard before nodding once. More than good. Her fingers tightened briefly around the bag strap. There is something my father left behind years ago. She hesitated. Something he wanted given to the person who once saved him. Caleb frowned softly, confusion settling deeper now. Then Rachel reached carefully into her bag and pulled out another envelope. Older, worn around the edges. His name written slowly across the front in handwriting that belonged to somebody no longer alive. Caleb stared quietly while snow drifted outside church windows, and suddenly nothing about this night felt accidental anymore. The church grew quieter after Rachel placed the envelope into Caleb's hands. Even the fire near the stone hearth seemed softer somehow, crackling low while snow drifted gently beyond stained glass windows. Caleb stared at the handwriting across the front for several long seconds. Simple letters. Careful strokes. His name written by someone who had remembered him long after he forgot them. That alone unsettled something deep inside him. He had spent years believing most things disappeared eventually. Missions, faces, sacrifices, even people. Yet somehow this moment sat in front of him like proof that kindness sometimes stayed alive in places nobody expected. Mia stood quietly beside Rachel, still wrapped in Caleb's oversized coat, one hand resting gently on Lucky, while Shadow sat nearby with unusual calm, watching everything unfold as if he already knew how this story bent towards something better. "You should open it," Pastor Michael said softly. Caleb looked uncertain for a moment, then slowly opened the envelope. Inside rested a folded letter yellowed slightly at the edges from time. Beneath it sat an old brass key attached to a weathered wooden tag, marked simply with one word burned into the surface. Silver Pines. Caleb unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting inside moved slower than strong hands once did. "To the man who carried me when I could not walk. I never learned your name that day, but I prayed for years that somehow kindness would find its way back to you. Life gave me more years than doctors expected, enough time to raise my daughter and love my granddaughter. If you are reading this, then God finally finished a promise I could not." Caleb paused briefly, swallowing hard. Rachel quietly wiped at one eye while Mia leaned against her side. Pastor Michael said nothing. Some moments deserved silence. Caleb continued reading slowly. 40 years ago, my family bought a small cabin near Silver Pines Lake. Nothing fancy. Quiet place. Peaceful. I wanted it sold after I passed, but later changed my mind. Too many people survive this world without ever finding home again. If my daughter believes you are the right man, then I want you to have it. No debt. No conditions. Just one request. Stay kind. Caleb lowered the letter slowly, staring toward the fireplace as emotions arrived in unfamiliar ways. Confusion first. Gratitude second. Grief somewhere underneath all of it. "I cannot accept this," he said quietly after a moment. Rachel stepped forward gently. "You already did," she said softly. Caleb looked up. She offered the faintest tired smile. "That night overseas," she continued, "my father said a stranger saved his life and disappeared before anyone could thank him. He never stopped believing someday kindness would come back around." Her voice trembled slightly now. "Then Mia comes home talking about a man who gave away the only warm coat he owned to keep her warm." Caleb glanced briefly toward Mia, who immediately lowered her eyes shyly. "And a giant dog," she added quietly. Shadow lifted his head proudly, like that part mattered most. Rachel laughed softly through tears. "When I opened the county envelope," she continued, "they approved temporary housing assistance. The same day, a lawyer finally contacted me about my father's property transfer paperwork. Everything suddenly moved at once after years of nothing." Pastor Michael smiled gently near the fireplace. "Funny timing." Caleb shook his head slowly. "Feels too strange." "Maybe," Pastor Michael said kindly. "Or maybe life still surprises tired people." Mia stepped forward then, carefully pulling something folded from her coat pocket. Another drawing. This one newer. Crayons again. A little cabin near a lake. Snow falling softly. Shadow beside Lucky. Caleb standing awkwardly near a porch while sunlight touched the trees. Above it, crooked handwriting read home. Caleb looked away briefly toward the church window. Hard thing about loneliness was how quietly it convinced people they deserved it. Years of drifting taught him not to expect much. Temporary jobs, temporary beds, temporary conversations. You stopped imagining places that lasted. Yet somehow here stood a little girl offering certainty with crayons. Rachel stepped closer. "You helped us when nobody else stopped," she said softly. "Please let us return at least part of that kindness." Caleb looked down at the brass key resting quietly in his palm, heavy enough to feel real. Outside, church bells rang softly again somewhere through the snow, gentle this time. Peaceful. Shadow stood and walked. 3 weeks later, winter finally began loosening its grip across Silver Pines Lake. Snow still covered the hills in patches, but sunlight stayed longer now, stretching gold across frozen water each afternoon like the season itself had finally decided to breathe again. Caleb stood quietly on the wooden porch of the cabin just after sunrise, hands wrapped around a warm coffee mug while cold mountain air drifted through the pine trees. The cabin was not large. Nothing fancy like people imagined when they heard words like inheritance. Just weathered cedar walls, an old stone chimney, and windows facing the lake where morning light painted everything soft and still. But after years of temporary places, something about it felt steady, honest, like it had been waiting patiently for somebody tired enough to appreciate silence. Shadow rested nearby on the porch steps, larger than life against the snow, watching ducks glide carefully across the edge of melting ice. Lucky darted around the yard clumsily, still too small for his oversized paws, chasing shadows he never caught, while Shadow occasionally sighed like an older brother quietly tolerating nonsense. Caleb almost smiled watching them. Strange how life changed. A month ago, he had been counting dollars inside a broken truck, wondering where he would sleep next. Now smoke rose gently from his own chimney, while coffee warmed hands no longer numb from survival. Inside the cabin, quiet signs of life slowly gathered. Boots drying by the fireplace, tools hanging neatly inside the mudroom after Caleb repaired loose boards and broken hinges nobody had touched for years. A stack of books Pastor Michael dropped off one afternoon because, as he claimed, every quiet cabin needed stories. Little things. Ordinary things. The kind people forgot mattered until they disappeared. Rachel and Mia visited almost every weekend now. Temporary housing assistants had helped them move into a small apartment closer to town, while Rachel slowly recovered enough to start part-time work again at a local diner. Life still looked difficult sometimes, but no longer hopeless. Caleb noticed the difference most in Mia. She laughed easier now. Slept better too, Rachel said. No more sitting awake by motel windows waiting for bad things to happen. This morning, tire tracks crunched softly through snow outside just after breakfast. Shadow lifted his head immediately, tail moving once before he even stood. Caleb already knew who it was. Mia jumped from Rachel's old sedan before the engine fully stopped, boots slipping slightly in snow, while Lucky barked excitedly from behind the car door. "Caleb," she shouted happily, running toward the porch. Shadow met her halfway like he had been expecting her all morning. Caleb laughed quietly, setting down his coffee. "Careful," he said. "Snow still wins arguments." Mia ignored that entirely and ran up the porch steps, carrying something folded carefully beneath one arm. Rachel followed more slowly, smiling in the way tired people smiled once life finally gave them room to breathe. Health returned slowly to her face now. Softer, stronger. Hope looked better on people than struggle ever did. "We brought breakfast," Rachel called, holding up paper bags. "Thought maybe somebody forgot how to cook." Caleb gave the smallest shrug. "I survived the military. Expectations are low." That earned a laugh from both of them. Inside, warmth settled naturally around the cabin now. Pancakes, coffee, quiet conversation near the fireplace while sunlight slipped gently through old windows. Mia eventually climbed beside Caleb near the couch, suddenly serious. "I made something," she said quietly. She handed him the folded paper. Another drawing. This one better than before. Still crayons. Still crooked in places, but clear. Caleb standing outside the cabin beside Shadow and Lucky. Rachel and Mia nearby. Smoke curling from the chimney. Sun above the lake. Across the top, carefully written in uneven letters, were words that stopped Caleb longer than expected. "Family finds you when you least expect it." Caleb looked away toward the window for a second, swallowing quietly before emotions could grow louder than he liked. "That is pretty good," he said softly. Mia smiled proudly. "Mom says people are gifts sometimes." Rachel looked down into her coffee cup, suddenly emotional herself. "My dad used to say kindness comes back eventually," she said quietly. "Just never on your schedule." Outside, wind moved gently through pine branches while sunlight touched the frozen lake. Peaceful. Still. The kind of quiet people spent years chasing without realizing it. Later that afternoon, after Rachel and Mia left, Caleb stood once more on the porch beside Shadow, watching the sun disappear behind distant hills. Snow glowed gold for a few brief minutes before dusk settled softly across the lake. Shadow rested against his leg without needing words. Caleb looked down at the old German shepherd and shook his head lightly. "You knew all along, huh?" Shadow blinked slowly, calm as ever. Maybe dogs really did understand things people missed. Or maybe kindness simply found strange ways of returning when nobody expected it anymore. Caleb looked toward warm light glowing through cabin windows behind him and realized something quietly important. For the first time in years, he was no longer just surviving. He belonged somewhere. And maybe that was how miracles really worked. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet kindness returning when somebody needed it most. Because sometimes heaven remembers the warmth we give away long after we forget it ourselves.